The tavern fell silent when the feared prince slammed his silver cup on the table, demanding more wine as his drunken laughter cut through the smoke-filled hall. Cloaked in arrogance, he sprawled by the fire, his boots on the table, his eyes cold as steel, while villagers shrank under his gaze. But from behind the counter, a peasant girl stepped forward, her dress damp with work, her hands steady, her voice breaking the air like a blade. "No more wine tonight." Faces turned pale, hearts froze, for no one had ever dared deny him. And in that single moment of defiance, the night promised not just punishment, but a dangerous turn that could change both their fates forever. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. Rain rattled the shutters and ran in thin threads down the warped wood, tapping at the tavern like impatient fingers. Smoke from the hearth curled toward the thatch and seeped back, tasting of damp ash. The room was crowded and close. Rough benches pressed together, cloaks steamed. A wheel of coarse bread sat in the center of the trestle like a promise already broken. The innkeeper's daughter moved between elbows with a wooden cup and a mental tally, measuring what was left in the casks against what the winter would take. She knew the feel of the floor through her soles, every soft spot hidden under green rushes and dry chaff. She knew the rhythm of the place, the low murmur after market day, the laughter that tried too hard when someone had found a lucky hen's egg, the sharp silence that meant a quarrel would flare. Tonight the silence came in pulses with the wind, as if the storm were breathing through the house. She kept count. 2 measures of ale to the carter whose boots never left mud, 1 thin ladle of stew for the widow with the bad wrist, a cup of wine into the lordling's leftover jar, because he had paid for it before dusk and was not here to claim it. The wine cask was set to the side, raised a few inches on a block, its bung sealed with cloth to guard against thieving hands. It was not meant for nights like this. It was meant for a wedding, or for a traveling merchant with silver to spare. She watched it the way a shepherd watches the last hayrick. The cup in her hand was her measure and her shield. She kept it clean out of habit, turning it in the rinse bucket until the water ran clear. Hooves clattered on the yard stones, low voices, the clank of metal on metal, and the scrape of heavy boots drew near. The door pushed open with a bigger gust of rain. The first man through wore a dark cloak soaked through, its edge flicking grease from the door latch. Behind him came others, their faces wet, a scattering of armor under riding leathers. The room shifted. Men drew in their elbows. Conversations died at the same point, as if a bell had rung. He entered last. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. His bearing made space where there was none. He lifted his hands, and a man behind him eased off his gloves, finger by finger, like unwrapping a gift in a room where no one wanted what it revealed. On the bare hand, a heavy ring caught firelight and threw it back into faces that could not risk looking at him for long. He did not look at the food or the smoke or the wind-wet cloaks on pegs. He looked at the hearth as if he had built it. The innkeeper's daughter felt the pivot in the room. Fear and attention turned on a hinge and faced him. Her father moved 1 step, then stopped, as if a string had been tied to his leg. The new men spread like oil, fast, certain, slippery. A space opened near the fire. A chair was claimed. The smaller stools around it were pushed aside by knee and scabbard. He sat without a sound and held out his hand without looking. A silver cup appeared, not from the tavern's shelf. It gleamed in the orange light, wrong as snow in summer. "Wine," said one of his men. The word fell into the hush like a knife point. She went to the cask because there was nothing else to do. The bung came out with a soft tug, and the scent of deep, sweet red rose over the sour tang of beer and the smoke of damp wood. She filled the cup. The weight of it struck her wrist. He drank without glancing at her. He passed the cup back to be filled again. The second measure slid over the lip, clear and smooth, a ribbon of color in the candlelight. She did not count aloud. 1, 2, 3. Each pour chipped away at the winter. She tried not to look at the level falling inside the cask. She felt it instead, in the way the cup took a heartbeat longer to fill. He spoke to his men then, not loud, not soft, a voice meant for those who already knew to listen. She heard no words at first, only the certainty. It made the room smaller. On the far bench, a child whimpered and was gathered up against a mother's chest. Someone coughed and failed to hide it. The innkeeper stood with both hands on the back of a chair as if it were a thing he could steady or lift. The girl moved through the press, the wooden cup in one hand, the silver in the other, like walking with two laws in her palms. Each time she poured, the silver caught the fire and threw it onto her wrist. By the fifth time, the weight of the cup told her what the sound of the wine did not. The cask was drawing down to its ghosts. "Another," someone near the hearth said, lazy as a cat. She glanced at the cask because she could not help it. The wooden tap had a wet sheen and a hollow ring in its hollow heart. The cloth bung lay on the trestle like a lost tongue. She put the silver cup on the table and reached for the measure. A bench skidded. A laugh turned into a shove. The scrape of wood on wood set her teeth on edge. She lifted the wooden cup to brace herself. Her palms remembered her brother's hands teaching her how to check a cask by weight, not sound. The memory hurt like old rope burn. She reached for the tap and heard the storm find a new seam above them. He had been watching without seeming to. She felt it. The small hairs along her forearm lifted as if the air had changed. He did not speak again. He waited. The waiting was worse than command. The room gathered itself like a held breath. She lifted the bung. She thought of rice, of grain, of the small sack with the last handful set aside from the rats. She thought of how many cups were left versus how many days before the market wagon's return. She thought of her father's face when he counted what they owed after the taxman's visit, and found his own fingers refusing to make the numbers lie. Her hand closed around the bung, and she pushed it home. "No more," she said. In the storm and the smoke, the words left her like a stone leaving a sling. No more wine tonight. The room froze. The sound that came from the cask was the quiet of a thing at rest. The silver cup, empty, waited on the table with its mouth open like a man waiting to be fed. Someone swore and then swallowed the word. The child's small hiccup snapped off. The wind chose that moment to slap the wall with a wet hand, and then there was only breathing. At the fire, his head turned toward her as if pulled on a chain. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "What did you say?" He asked it like a surgeon finding a thorn and deciding whether to draw blood. She held the wooden cup. It was not a weapon. It was not a shield. It was a thing that made measure into law. The heat from the hearth warmed the side of her face and left the other half cold. "You have had what we can spare," she said. Her voice did not climb. It did not bow. "No more wine tonight." Around them, the air drew tight. A man half rose and sat again. A boot scuffed. The innkeeper made a sound that no one would call a word. A dog under the table crept closer to the hearth and put its nose on its paws and would not look at anyone. She did not look at her father. She did not look at the door. She looked at the man with the ring. He rose. He did it as if gravity had asked his permission first. His men shifted with him, a ripple rolling through a pond crowded with reeds. He did not slam the chair back. He let it stay where it was. He took one step, then another, and each one found a floorboard that did not squeal. The silence was so complete she could hear the cloth of his cloak move against its own weight. She could taste her own fear, copper and stale. It did not shame her. It told her she was alive. The cup in her hand was suddenly rough. Splinters she had sanded a dozen times were crisp against her skin again. If she put it down now and lifted the silver instead, the night would move again and end with the cask empty and a room full of men who would forget her by morning. If she held it, she would be remembered for the wrong thing. "Daughter," the innkeeper said, barely moving his lips. She did not answer. She kept the cup at her side. She kept her chin level. The line of his mouth told her he was thinking of debts and ropes, and she knew he was asking her to be small. She had been small for too many winters. The storm's breath thundered again, and a drip found its way from thatch to floor and tapped her boot. He stood before her with the fire at his back. The light made a crown of heat around his head and placed his face in shadow that moved when the flames twisted. From closer, the ring did not look like wealth. It looked like a thing made to fit and never come off. He held out his hand. Not like a beggar, not like a judge. He held it out palm up, asking for the cup. If she had given it, some part of her would have been given with it. A thread that once snapped could not be knotted in the same place. She lifted the wooden cup into the space between them, but did not set it in his hand. The air there felt colder. He looked at her fingers where they did not tremble. His eyes moved from the cup to her face and back again. "Is this your father's house?" he said, "or mine?" "It is ours to keep," she said, "and your men have eaten." She heard the hushed inhale behind her like a drawn blade, the collective terror at the line she had stepped over and would not step back from. The word ours hung there, heavy as a smith's hammer. It was a dangerous word in a room and a time like this. She felt it. He weighed it as if he could see the dent it would leave. His jaw clenched just once, a small pulse in the cheek near the ear. Then a light went on in his eyes that had nothing to do with the fire, and she understood that this was not a man unused to defiance. It was a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be denied, and was surprised to find the world still held that flavor. The silence cut to a thin edge. A bench creaked. A spoon clinked on a bowl. The storm leaned its shoulder against the wall again. The girl watched his hand. He watched the cup. The rest of the room watched both and dared not breathe. He reached. His fingers came to rest lightly on the rim of the wooden measure. They did not yank. They did not crush. They rested there as if he were testing the give of the wood, the roughness of the grain, the strength of the hand that held it. She could feel the warmth of him across that small bridge. It was almost nothing. It was unbearable. He might have smiled. He did not. His mouth's corner twitched, and his gaze flicked sideways for the first time toward the door. The motion was a signal. A man near the entrance understood it before it was finished. Leather creaked, metal whispered, and the bar that had been lifted for their entrance was set on its brackets, waiting. "Enough," he said, quieter than before. She heard two meanings in the single word. Enough of refusal. Enough of the waste of this public pause. She kept her hand where it was. He gave her a small tilt of his head, a mark of courtesy or mockery. The difference was a coin's width. The innkeeper's breathing had become a rasp. He took a step and stopped when a guard's palm turned toward him, not threatening, only a reminder. The men who had come with the prince formed without effort the shape of a circle that had only one opening. That opening was between him and her. It was not a place for the innkeeper to stand. "Daughter," the innkeeper said again, louder. "Do not—" Her father's voice broke. Not from age, not from fear. From the simple failure of sound when a man says a thing he knows will not change the next thing that happens. His eyes were on her hands. The rest of him was already later, already imagining what would follow. She would not follow him there. She would stay in this moment because it was the only place where choice existed. The man at the door shifted his feet and ran his fingers along the bar, as if to wipe rain from it. A soldier near the hearth adjusted his stance to keep his back from feeling the heat too long. Another leaned his shoulder to the shutter and pressed it tight. The storm's voice dropped to a hum as the wood set against wood. The room made itself small and kept the weather out and the people in. She could smell his cloak now. Not the perfume of a court, not that. Horse and wet wool, and a bitter herb crushed under heel. The scent of travel and command. She had grown up with the smell of yeast and smoke and spilled ale. This other smell entered her lungs and made her own house feel foreign. "Do you understand what you ask?" he said. He touched the cup, and his thumb slid over the rim. What you deny. If I pour again, they will drink it, she said. And there will be nothing left tomorrow. What do you know of tomorrow? He said, and the question was not cruel so much as astonished. She knew the look of an empty shelf. She knew the price of a pound of flour when the road had washed out. She knew how the old men counted out their last coins for a funeral candle and always asked for 1 wick less than they needed. She knew too much for her age. She did not say any of it. She said, "Enough to keep this house standing." He considered the words as if he could see their weight in the air. He looked over her shoulder at the others and found what he expected. Fear, calculation, a few blank stares. When his eyes came back to her, there was something like interest there, thin and sharp. "Then you will serve me differently," he said. Her breath went shallow. The room did not move. The rain held steady on the roof. She thought she knew what that sentence could mean. She thought of shame that did not wash off. He stood still and let her think it. Then he lifted his hand from the cup and replaced it on her wrist, where her pulse kicked once, twice, traitorously loud to her own ears. A scrape at the door made every head twitch. He did not look away from her. "You will not empty the cask," he said. "You will not pour for any man in this room." A beat. "But you will not go to your bed and lock the door." Her lips parted and closed. He had not said the worst thing. He had not said the best either. He had said something that balanced on a blade, requiring her to place a foot in mid-air and trust stone to appear. It was a cruelty and a mercy both. The wooden cup felt heavier than iron. "Please," the innkeeper said. The word cracked like ice. A guard near the bar shifted and cleared his throat. Someone's chair leg gave way to a knot and squealed. In the corner, a candle ran down to its last finger of tallow and drowned its own wick, sending up a black thread of smoke that reached for the rafters. The smell of spent fat thickened the air, and in it, her stomach turned. He tilted his head again, as if asking a question without words. She did not answer, because there was no answer that would make any of this right. Only answers that kept part of it from being wrong in a way that would rot their lives for years. "If you take me," she said, and the words dragged through difficulty. "They will have no one to—" He cut her off without speaking. His fingers pressed just enough to make her notice the difference between defiance and resistance. He had the grace not to enjoy the touch. He had the power to make it matter anyway. His attention narrowed on the place where her skin warmed his. A soldier at the door coughed. Another shifted. The sound of the wind changed, as if the night had turned its face to listen. He moved his eyes to the side again, and with that small permission, the man at the door set his hands to the heavy bar. In the long beat before wood met iron, the girl's gaze flicked once to the faces around the room. She saw the widow with the bad wrist press her lips against her knuckles to keep from crying out. She saw the boy who carried Pete to the hearth every day stare at the floor and will himself invisible. She saw her father swallow and pull himself up straight, as if the string holding him had been tied higher. Her attention returned to the man in front of her. He looked down at the wooden measure and then up into her face. She saw in him something she did not want to see. Not just anger, not just pride, but a question he had never let anyone answer. He moved his hand. The bar fell into its iron cradle with a quiet, efficient thud as his fingers reached to close on her wrist. The tavern was sealed, the bar across the door humming with finality, and every pair of eyes turned toward the place where his hand wrapped around her wrist. The heat of the hearth pressed against their backs, but the chill of the moment ran deeper than any draft. Her pulse stammered beneath his fingers. His grip was not cruel, but it was unyielding. He was not taking a prisoner, not yet. He was making a point. She could feel that truth in the measured pressure, in the silence that followed it. "Do you believe me harmless?" he asked, his voice low enough that the nearest villagers leaned in without realizing it. She raised her chin, though the fire stung her eyes. "I believe you dangerous when you drink what we cannot give." Something shifted in his expression, half disbelief, half reluctant interest. Behind him, his men stiffened at the boldness, waiting for the crack of temper they knew so well. But the crack did not come. Instead, he released her wrist and claimed the wooden cup from her hand. He turned it in the light, studying the grooves worn into its rim by years of use. The smile that touched his mouth was quick, sharp, and gone. "This cup holds more defiance than most men I have met at court," he said. Then he raised his voice. "But pride has a cost." The steward at his shoulder cleared his throat. "My lord, the penalty—" "Silence," the prince said without looking at him. "The penalty is mine to name." The villagers pressed back against the walls, shoulders brushing plaster and timber. Ellen stood rooted to the rushes, her palms open, emptied of both cups. "What will you take from us?" her father asked, his voice breaking against the weight of the hall. The prince looked to the casks, to the hanging meats, to the modest bundles stored on the shelves. He might have ordered all of it carried out into the mud. He might have claimed the tavern itself under royal right. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the girl. "Not your stores," he said. "Not your roof." Relief rippled, short-lived before he finished. "I will take her." The room erupted, not with shouts, but with gasps choked down into silence. The innkeeper stumbled forward until the nearest soldier planted a hand on his chest and held him fast. "You cannot," he rasped. "She is my blood." The prince's eyes were like flint. "Then pray I value it more than I value your cask." Ellen swallowed hard, throat dry, but her voice carried. "I will not go as spoil." His gaze snapped back to her, and for a heartbeat they stood locked, the tavern watching as if time itself waited for the answer. His lips curved with a dangerous patience. "Then go as recompense," he said. "Your hand emptied my cup before my men, and before my men it must be answered. You will serve at my hall until I decide the debt is done." The words settled heavy. The villagers saw ruin in them, even if he had not demanded her body or her house. To be taken from home by force was no small thing. To be carried to the castle was a kind of death. Ellen's father tried again, desperate. "My lord, take coin instead. Take the pig, the wagon." "No." The single word cut him clean. The captain stepped forward with a heavy cloak, its edges soaked from the rain outside. Two guards moved to her side, not brutal, but insistent. One touched her elbow. The other shifted his stance to block her retreat. She turned to her father. His face looked older than it had that morning, lined deep by fear and helpless rage. He shook his head once, pleading without words. Her breath caught. She had spoken because silence would have stolen everything. Now her words had stolen her instead. She let the guards guide her toward the door. The bar was lifted. Cold night air swept in with the rain. Torches hissed in the damp, casting the yard in uncertain orange light. The men mounted swiftly, horses stamping, bits ringing. She was placed on a spare mount, the cloak thrown over her shoulders. The leather was too stiff, the saddle too high, and she gripped the pommel to keep her balance. Flanking guards closed in, their torches throwing shadows over her face. The prince mounted last. His horse, black and restless, stamped once and fell into place at her side. He did not look at her. He looked forward, the line of his jaw tight as stone. The tavern door slammed behind them, leaving her father and the village locked in silence. The only sound was the wet rhythm of hooves as the party pulled onto the road. The night was deep and sodden. Rain had eased to a mist, clinging to cloaks and dripping from bridles. The road wound between hedges, their branches clawing at riders' sleeves. Mud sucked at hooves, splattering up onto wool and leather. Ellen's hands ached from holding the saddle pommel, but she would not ask for help. She fixed her eyes on the road ahead, lit only by the two torches carried at the front. Now and again, she felt the prince's gaze flicker to her, but when she turned, his face was angled away, unreadable. After an hour, the village was long gone behind them. The tavern's glow vanished. Only the dark fields stretched outward, punctuated by the pale glimmer of farmhouses shuttered tight. A dog barked once in the distance and fell silent. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but steady. If your purpose was humiliation, you had it in the tavern. Why drag me further? His reply came after a pause, cold as the rain. Because humiliation fades. Service teaches longer. She pressed her lips together. Service, a word that could be twisted into anything. They rode on. The mist thickened, beading on hair and lashes. Ellen pulled the cloak tighter, though the damp seemed to seep through skin to bone. At last, looming out of the night, she saw the black line of the castle walls. Torches burned in the gatehouse, reflected on wet stone. The portcullis rattled upward, water dripping from its teeth. The horses clattered over the bridge. Inside the bailey, men-at-arms turned their heads, whispers stirring. The sight of a village girl among the prince's retinue was spectacle enough. They dismounted. Her legs shook as her boots met the cobbles. A guard took her arm to steady her, but she pulled free, squaring her shoulders. The prince strode ahead without looking back, water dripping from his cloak, the silver cup at his belt gleaming even in the low light. A horn sounded once from the tower, calling the household to witness. Torches flared in brackets. Doors opened. Figures emerged. Guards, servants, courtiers roused from bed, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. The great doors of the hall swung open, spilling warm light onto the wet stone of the yard. Inside, banners stirred faintly in the draught. The seneschal stood ready, lips pressed thin, his eyes moving from the prince to the girl and back again. The retinue formed up behind them. The girl was guided forward, her cloak dragging across the wet threshold as she entered the space where judgment was made. And above the muttering of the crowd, a page's feet slapped against the flagstones as he ran toward the royal apartments to carry word of what the prince had brought home. The hush deepened as the steward announced the arrival. The courtiers leaned in, eager for spectacle. The guards set their stance waiting. Ellen stood at the edge of the hall, every sense sharpened, every eye upon her, as the prince walked to the foot of the dais and turned. The silence broke when the seneschal's voice rang out. "My lord, what is this?" The prince lifted the wooden cup high enough for all to see. His eyes swept the assembly, daring them to question further, and at that very moment the page reached the king's chamber door. The page's heel clicked out of sight, swallowed by the corridor's bend, and the hall breathed like a body waiting on a verdict. Torches hissed in their brackets. The damp on wool and leather steamed faintly in the heat. He stood at the foot of the dais because the dais was the king's, and he would not stand higher, not until called. He felt the weight of every gaze, the seneschal's cool measurement, the steward's unease. The guards trained stillness, already calculating lines of force and exits if tempers broke. Most of all, he felt the heat at the back of his neck, a village girl's presence burning there without needing to be seen. He lifted the wooden cup, a simple scarred thing. When he turned it under the light, the room watched the grain spin, as if it might spell out an omen. He liked the soundlessness of it, the message carried without drums or trumpet. He could speak with it later. For now, it spoke for him. The seneschal inclined his head, the movement a question wrapped in obedience. "My lord, the household is roused." "Then let them see," he said. "Summon the butler." The butler came with a towel over one arm and a face that had long ago learned to hide opinion beneath duty. He bowed to the seneschal, then to the prince, then placed himself where he could see both. "You will take her under charge," the prince said, not turning. "She will serve tonight in the hall." "You bring a villager to pour for the court?" The seneschal's tone did not change, but the words had edges. "I bring recompense," he said. He let the cup hang at his side. "And I set my house in order." A murmur ran along the benches like mice along a beam. It was not disapproval, not yet. It was appetite, for spectacle, for a fall, for anything to break the sameness of winter nights. "Punishment should be swift," the steward ventured. "The household thrives on clear lines." Punishment, he said softly, is not always the sharpest line. The butler's eyes flicked to the girl standing near the pillar, cloak soaked, hair clinging dark to her cheek. He assessed without pity or kindness. Can she carry a ewer? She can carry a house on her back, the prince said. He did not know if it was true. He found he wanted it to be. Then she will carry wine, the butler said. The smallest sneer touched the word. Not for me, the prince said, and that turned heads. A pause, thin as a blade. It cut across the seneschal's practiced calm and the steward's neat categories. You refuse to be served. The seneschal began. I refuse to be served tonight as if nothing happened, he said. He raised the wooden cup again. If there is a measure poured, it answers to this. Another murmur. A guard's boot scraped on stone. He felt the pressure build in the room the way a man feels a horse gather under him. Fine. Let it build. He would ride it. Set the trestles, he said. Wake the kitchen. Light every brazier in this hall. At this hour, the steward said before he could help himself. At this hour, he said, we wait for the king in readiness, not hunger. He did not add what everyone knew. Waiting hungry bred fear. Waiting with meat and heat bred boldness. He needed the second more than the first. The butler inclined his head to the nearest pages. A quick flurry of activity followed. Boys running, shoulders braced under the weight of trestles dragged from the walls, rushes kicked into place, the smell of new straw rising. A brazier sparked, then caught. The hall brightened, shadows jumping up the painted saints and crest beasts marching along the walls. He glanced once toward the pillar. She had not moved. The cloak sat wrong on her shoulders. The torchlight made her look carved from damp oak, the same stubborn grain running through. He found the faintest itch under his skin, appetite's cousin, curiosity's sharper twin. Take her, he said to the butler, and turned away as the man led her toward the buttery hatch. He had a dozen other things to place. Yet even as he spoke to the seneschal in measured phrases, that small itch persisted, like a note he could not name in a song he had heard all his life. He welcomed it. It drowned out the older, duller sound, the memory of every nod he had bought with fear. The buttery was narrow and loud, the air suddenly thick with the smell of sour ale and new fire. She followed the butler down the worn stone, down 2 steps into a space where the warmth came not from grandeur, but from work. Kegs squatted like old men. A cask of wine stood taller and prouder, its hoops dark with age, its tap clean. Hang the cloak, the butler said. No drips on the flagstones. She unpinned the cloak, shaking out rain, and hung it on a peg. Her dress clung damp to her. She pushed back the hair that stuck to her face, aware that her hand shook. She willed it to be steadier by the time she reached the ewer. Do they have names? She asked without thinking, nodding at the casks. The butler paused, surprised into a snort. Ale or wine? The casks, she said. At home. This is not home, he said. This is a hall. He handed her a silver ewer. It was heavier than it looked. The handle bit her palm. You will pour when I nod, he said. You will not spill. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not lift your eyes higher than a man's belt. She raised the ewer to test its balance. The rules slid over her skin like cold water. And if I do all that, she said, I will be forgiven? You will be tolerable, he said, which is better than you were an hour ago. She let the retort die. It would not buy her anything here except pain. She lifted the ewer again. The weight settled into her shoulder, a familiar ache. If her hands could carry winter and keep a roof dry, they could carry this. The butler watched her lift, pour into the ewer's belly from the tap, and set it square without slop. He grunted. You have poured before. Not from silver, she said. It spills the same, he said, and was gone to instruct a page to ready trenchers, his voice clipped and efficient. She took a breath, and held it until the pounding under her ribs slowed. The buttery door opened and closed with a slap as boys darted through, carrying loaves, knives, a slab of cured meat. The noise of the hall drifted in on each swing. She could feel the size of that space pressing on the small of her back. A page no older than her brother had been looked at her hands, at the ewer, at her face. "Are you afraid?" he whispered, not unkindly. "Yes," she said, and the truth steadied her more than a lie would have. He nodded as if she had passed a test he respected. "Do not spill." "I will not," she said. And he smiled like a secret, then vanished into the rush of orders. She lifted the ewer and stepped into the hall. The transformation jarred. The trestles were set, fine cloths thrown over them, the wrinkled edges smoothed by quick hands, bowls of salt set like jewels, bread loaves torn into halves and set on trenchers. The brazier's glow licked the metal of helmets and the gilt on painted shields. The air had shifted from raw and expectant to charged. He stood where she had left him, and the hall had arranged itself around him. He spoke to no one and to everyone. Pages moved when his hand tilted. Guards widened the space between trestles at a glance. The seneschal stood near the dais and made notes with charcoal on a wax tablet, cataloging the night like an auditor of sins. She kept her eyes lower than belts and higher than the rushes. Even so, she felt the pull of him each time she turned at the end of a trestle. Not his face. The space he made by standing in it. It was like walking close to a brazier. The heat reached for you without touching. "Here," the butler said, and she stopped at a bench where 3 men in good wool sat with their hands folded as if prayer might shield them from being noticed. The butler nodded once, and she poured for each. Steady, silent, the liquid sound of wine smoothing the rough air. She moved down the hall. She poured for a guard whose eyes thanked her without daring words. She poured for a courtier whose mouth curled as if the ewer had offended him by existing in her hand. She poured for a clerk with ink on his fingers. She did not pour for the prince. On that, the butler's nod did not come. She learned the hall's pulse in minutes. The way the noise dipped when he moved. The way it rose where he did not look. The way men's shoulders lived inside their livery. Some resting easy, some hunching against the next hour's weather. When she returned to the buttery to refill, the butler followed. "You will go to the dais when I tell you," he said. "You will set the ewer near the prince's place and wait." "I will not pour for him," she said. "You will wait," he said, and his tone made the word an order with more than one edge. She nodded. She did not know if she could do it. She knew she would have to. She stepped out again, the ewer fuller and heavier, the muscles of her forearm burning. The hall's light had warmed further. More torches had been lit, making the painted saints look down with new interest. He saw her coming before she wanted him to. He did not speak. He did not make her work easier. He did something worse. He shifted half a step so that she must cross in front of him to reach the dais. The cloth of his cloak brushed the ewer's lip. She felt heat through metal. "Mind the floor," he said, as if the warning were kindness. "Mind your men," she said under her breath, and his mouth tightened, not entirely in anger. The butler set her at the edge of the dais. She placed the ewer on a low table. Her sleeve brushed polished wood. She stood with her hands folded, her shoulders square, the back of her neck prickling with the awareness of every eye on her. He approached his place. This close, she could see the tiny scar at his wrist where a hawk's talon had once struck. She looked away before he could call it staring. "It seems," he said, conversational to the air, "that for some, a cup is not a cup but a law." She watched the ewer. "For some, a cup is a mirror." He heard that. She could tell by the slight intake of breath from someone behind him. Someone who appreciated a retort where it did not belong. His head tilted. She felt the weight of his attention like a hand between her shoulder blades. "Pour for the hall," he said to the butler, not to her. "Serve them. Leave me." "As you say," the butler said, but his glance slid to her for a heartbeat. He knew a test when he saw one. The hall filled with small noises. Knives rasped against whetstones and then against bread crusts. A ladle dipped into pottage in the kitchen. The brazier's coals settled with a sigh, and threaded through it, the rumor's first soft threads spun out of what they were watching without words to hold it yet. She poured again. The ewer grew lighter, her arm less numb and more capable, as if it had remembered its own strength. The rhythm steadied her. She did not look at him. That was its own defiance. "More meat," someone called, greedy. The steward signaled, and a platter passed in. Night had taught the kitchen to always have something ready. The smell of roasted fat curled into hungry places and soothed them. And then the sound they had all been measuring themselves against arrived, bootsteps from the corridor. Not many. Not hurried. The kind of measured tread that made any room remember who owned it. The seneschal stepped back from the dais. Guards' postures sharpened almost without moving. Heads turned like flowers following sun. She went still. The ewer hung from her hand. He did not look at her. His eyes went to the doors. They opened not with a crash, but with a sound like a book being laid down flat upon a table. Quiet. Final. The king entered. Age had carved him lean, but authority made him taller than his bones. A handful of officers flanked him. No trumpets, no cloak train, simply his presence, drawing obedience up from the floor itself. He took in the hall with one sweep. The trestles set, the brazier's heat, the faces turned toward him, the prince standing not on the dais. His gaze snagged where it was meant to, a village girl with a silver ewer, a wooden cup in the prince's hand, a pattern wrong enough to be an insult. He moved to the first step of the dais and did not climb. One hand rested on the carved arm of the king's chair. He did not sit. He did not need to. "Explain," he said. The seneschal opened his mouth. The prince spoke first. "There was an abuse," he said. "I ended it. By bringing it into my hall." The king's eyebrows barely climbed, and it was as good as laughter, stripped of mirth. "To be ended where it began," the prince said. He lifted the wooden cup, as if stating a case in court. The king's gaze dropped to the cup. A small tick tightened his jaw. "Do you mock me with a toy?" "This," the prince said, "is the measure my men forgot. I remind them." The king's attention flicked to the girl. She felt it like a cold wind. "What is your name?" he asked. She swallowed. "Ellen, sire." "Whose blood are you?" "An innkeeper's," she said, "and my own." A few heads turned at that. He saw them. He let the flicker run along the benches and die. "You refuse to pour," he said, not asking. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She met his gaze because she could not survive bowing to two men at once. Because there was not enough for the winter. His eyes held hers and made her feel seen the way a tax ledger is seen. "Your roof is not my concern," he said. "Order is." The prince's mouth tightened. "Order does not drink a village dry." The king's head turned slowly, and old trees creak. "Do you lecture me on order?" "I speak of my house," the prince said, measured, "and of what happened under my name." A pause lengthened. It pulled the hall thinner, like taffy stretched to a breaking shine. The king looked back to the girl. "You stand in my hall with a silver ewer, because my son brought you here. You will set it down. You will take the wooden cup. You will stand on the edge of the dais and wait without moving." She did as he said. The wood felt truer in her palm than the silver had. She mounted the lowest step, the line between rushes and carved oak stark at the toes of her boots. The whole hall watched the way her breath moved the fine hairs near her ear. The butler closed his own mouth on what could have been a protest. The seneschal's stylus paused on wax. The king turned to the prince. "You sought to teach your men." "Yes," the prince said. "Then learn first," the king said. "Learn that your temper is not policy." He took a step up, then another, and then turned back, still not sitting. His voice traveled easily without force. "The hall will eat, it will drink, It will wait, and then judgment will be made. The order rearranged the night. Pages leaped to serve. The butler breathed again and shifted his nods. The steward sent a boy to the kitchen with a nod of meat and bread. The guards relaxed one notch. Ellen stood where commanded. The wooden cup warmed in her hand. It felt like an oath pressed into her palm. And while the hall moved in obedience, the prince moved the way he always did, almost not at all, so that people forgot he was a blade. He took his place at the lower table to the right, leaving the high space empty for the king to fill when he chose. It changed the current. Men who would have spoken into his ear now had to cross a distance to do it. Many chose not to. He watched Ellen instead, and she felt it like a brand. The first trenchers reached the tables. Stew and bread set hunger at bay. The noise rose as appetite did the king's bidding. Bowed heads over bowls, carefully measured laughter, knives cutting meat, spoons scraping pottage. The butler nodded at her. She moved with the wooden cup, not pouring, only standing ready as if that fact alone could balance the earlier refusal. She felt like a declaration with legs. She stopped near his place. He did not look up. He lifted his hand, and she could feel the old pattern trying to assert itself, cup extended, servant moving, the law of habit. She did not move. After a slow breath, he lowered his hand. It was slight. It was thunder. Bold, someone muttered 3 benches down, a man who had used his life hiding. She is a fool, someone else said, and the word slid off her shoulder like a drop of rain off oiled cloth. She had been called worse by Winter. He spoke again, this time without lifting his hand, half to the air. You will not always have your way here. I never did, she said, the answer barely more than breath. He heard it. She knew by the tight line at his mouth and the way his knuckles smoothed once against the table's edge. She stood, the wood warming her palm. Each breath became its own kind of count. Beyond the hall, the storm was ebbing. On the walls, painted eyes watched with gold-leaf patience. Rumor spun itself in the corners. A girl brought in chains of expectation, not iron. A prince who set her where everyone could see. A king who had not yet decided what weight to drop. The butler came and went like a pendulum. The seneschal's stylus scratched, then paused, scratched again. The steward made neat stacks of responsibilities in his mind. The guards' fatigue settled into their bones but did not loosen their grip on spears. Then the thing that would be remembered happened. It did not come with a shout. It came like a hand laid on a fevered brow, soft, shocking. The prince's page, the same boy with the secret smile, set the silver cup near Ellen's knee on the lower step and stepped back to his master, eyes lowered. She stared at the silver. She did not touch it. The prince stood. Not all the way. Half risen, half seated, he hovered in a space that was not commanded by anyone. The room hushed by an inch. He took 1 pace toward the dais, then stopped, aligning himself with the angle of her body, the line of the wooden cup. He did not speak to her. He addressed the hall. A cup is a measure, he said. It is not a mouth. A page blinked at the turn of phrase. He had a poet's ear he hid under rag and duty. The prince turned his head a fraction toward the king, offering the moment without losing it. The king did not frown. He did not smile. He watched. The butler, caught between command and custom, lifted his hand to summon her to pour for the prince. He dropped it before the signal carried. The hall saw the motion and made a story of it immediately. And then the prince did lift his hand. He extended it into the space between himself and Ellen. Palm up, the polite ask that could be a trap or a trust. She looked not at his hand, but at the wooden cup in her own. The oak grain ran under her thumb like a path through a field she had walked since childhood. She could step off it. She could not walk backward. No, she said. It was not loud. It was not a shout. It was the same word as in the tavern, but made new by stone and rank and the king's eyes on her. The hall froze. A guard's cough died unborn. A spoon clinked. and then lay still. The prince did not flinch. For one heartbeat, something like relief sliced across his face, startling her more than any anger could have. It vanished. The world held its breath for someone to strike. Bootsteps again from the corridor, sharper this time. The king moved his chin, and the guard captain stepped through the nearest door and took his place to the left of the dais. Along the walls, men straightened as if a belt had been yanked tight, the moment pressed down like a hand. A hush that had layers in it, salt, smoke, old fear, settled over everything. The king's gaze had returned to Ellen and the wooden cup. He spoke, each word placed on the air with care. "Who is this peasant girl," he said, "that dares silence a prince?" The king's words struck the hall like a bell. The air quivered with them, a soundless vibration that reached even the furthest benches. Men shifted, not daring to breathe too loud. Torches hissed. The wooden cup trembled faintly where Ellen gripped it, though her arm was steady. At the edge of the dais, she stood half in shadow, half in light, the center of a storm she had never meant to summon. Her throat burned dry, but her voice would not be silent. "I am no more than I seem, sire," she said, each syllable clear. "But I could not pour what was not there." The hush deepened, as if the stone walls themselves strained to listen. The king regarded her with the stillness of a man who had long ago mastered anger into ice. "And yet you stand in my hall, cup in hand, while my son is refused before his own men." Her fingers dug into the wood. "If refusal was a crime, then I am guilty. But I did it for truth, not spite." A rustle ran down the trestles. Some were scandalized. Some, secretly, hungered for the boldness of her words. The prince rose half a pace from his place, not quite stepping forward. His gaze burned hot against the side of her face. "She wronged me, father, but not falsely. The tavern's cask was near hollow." The king's eyes flicked to him. "You defend her insolence?" "I defend what I saw with my own eyes," the prince said. His tone was measured, but his chest felt tight. "If she is guilty, then so am I, for pressing the cup too many times." The declaration shocked the hall more than the girl's defiance. Courtiers glanced to one another, uncertain whether to read humility or madness in his words. The seneschal stepped forward, voice low but sharp. "Sire, the order of things must be preserved. If a peasant may stand so, refusing service to a prince, what will follow?" "What follows," the prince cut in, "is what we decide here, not what fear invents." His brother, seated nearby, let a faint laugh escape, one of disbelief and scorn. The sound carried enough that all heard. "You speak of decision as if you rule this hall," the heir said. The prince's jaw flexed. He did not answer. Not yet. Ellen kept her eyes forward, though her skin prickled under their words. The weight of noble scorn pressed on her like the wet of the storm had pressed on the tavern roof. But she would not bend. The king raised his hand, silencing the undercurrent of whispers. His gaze pinned her again. "You claim necessity. You claim honesty. Very well. But service remains the path of recompense. You will serve here, under watch, until I say otherwise." Her heart thudded. The butler's eyes gleamed with satisfaction at the decree. Yet the prince's voice broke through before silence could set. "Not as punishment," he said, loud enough for all. "As symbol." The word landed strangely. Some frowned. Some nodded. The king's gaze sharpened. "Explain." The prince stepped from his place and approached, but stopped short of the dais, leaving a careful gap of space. Let her stand not in disgrace, but in witness. A reminder of what hunger feels like when men with titles forget. A dangerous murmur rose. Some saw wisdom, others insolence. "You turn a tavern girl into a banner?" the heir scoffed. "How long before every peasant thinks themselves worth a crest?" The prince's head turned, sharp. "Better that than a crown too heavy for the head that wears it." The heir's face darkened, but the king's lifted hand stilled the flare. He studied his younger son, then the girl. In his silence, the hall seemed to bow lower. Finally he said, "Let it be so. She will serve. But remember, symbols cut both ways." The decree settled like stone. The steward made a mark on his tablet. The butler's mouth pressed thin, half resentment, half triumph. The guards shifted but did not relax. Ellen breathed, shallow but steady. A strange thing filled her chest, fear still, but threaded with something else, dignity. When the king turned and left with his officers, the room exhaled. Conversation rose again in cautious waves. The trestles filled with renewed noise, but at the dais' edge, she and the prince remained in the silent eye of it. Later, in the cloister walk, the air damp and cool, their paths crossed again. She carried the wooden cup still, unwilling to set it down in unfamiliar walls. He leaned against a pillar, shadows across his face. "You spoke with boldness before the king," he said. Her hand tightened around the cup. "I spoke as I must. If I lied, I would have shamed myself more than I shamed you." His mouth tilted, almost a smile, but not. Few would risk shame for truth. She looked at him, the torchlight catching his cheekbone. "And you, my lord? Did you defend me for truth or for pride?" The question hung between them, sharp. His eyes flickered, and for the first time that night, his silence seemed bare, not armored. Before he could answer, the butler's voice carried from the far end of the walk, calling her name. She turned away, cloak brushing stone, leaving him staring after her with the weight of words unsaid. The night stretched on. Orders were given, writs drafted, arrangements made. By dusk the next day, she was sent back toward her village, guards at her side, the king's seal pressed into parchment that promised protection. The wooden cup rode in her satchel. At the castle gate, he stood above on the battlements, watching as she crossed the bridge. The storm had broken. The air smelled of wet earth and ash. She did not look back. Not once. He remained until the line of her cloak was lost against the road. And though the court bustled behind him with gossip and judgments, he felt only the silence of the space she had left. He closed his hand over the cold stone of the wall and whispered to himself, unheard by any, "No one has ever said no to me twice." The words lingered, low as thunder, as he turned away. Dawn had not yet cut the sky when the road unwound before her again. The escort rode with their cloaks pulled tight, the iron of their buckles dull with yesterday's rain. Ellen held the satchel against her hip with one hand, the other steady on the saddle's pommel. The wooden cup inside the satchel knocked softly with each step of the horse, a heartbeat she could not quiet. She did not look back toward the castle. The gate's shadow had swallowed her long before, and the world had narrowed to hedgerow and mud and the pale breath of horses. The guards spoke little. When they did, they lowered their voices as if the road itself listened. They reached the village as dusk bled into evening. Smoke rose from low roofs, blue and thin. The tavern's door stood shut, lamplight seeping through the cracks, as if the house were holding its breath. Her father was a dark shape in the yard before the men at arms could call, his hands twisting in his apron, knuckles white. "Daughter," he said, and the word was a prayer and a warning both. She slid from the saddle stiffly. The ground tilted under her boots and righted. "I am here," she said, and she did not hide the roughness in her voice. "I am brought under writ, not chain." The captain of the escort raised a hand, and the yard stilled. He pulled a roll of parchment from his pouch and held it aloft. The green wax seal caught the lamplight. "By the king's grace," the captain said. "Hear the words." He broke the seal and read, not loudly, not softly, but with the even tone of a man who knew the power belonged not to him but to the seal. The village would be exempt from certain fees this season. No retinue could seize stores without written cause. No man or woman of this household could be pressed into service without writ. A murmur ran through the small crowd gathered by the door. The reeve pushed forward, hat in hand, eyes flicking from seal to face. He was not a friend, not an enemy. He was the ledger, made man. "Is it so?" he asked, chin lifting toward Ellen as if she could grant legitimacy. "It is so," she answered. "And there is more." She set her hand to the satchel and lifted the wooden cup. The sight of it eased something tight in her chest. She held it high enough for those nearest to see the familiar grain. Her father exhaled. He reached out as if to touch the rim, then stopped, reverent. "Bring it inside," he said, his voice hollow with relief. "Hang it where it belongs." The crowds parted. The tavern's door opened to the breath of warmer air. Rushes had been changed. The hearth sent a steady glow across the low ceiling. Ellen stepped through the threshold and crossed to the peg behind the bar. Her hand hesitated in the air for a heartbeat. Then she set the cup on its hook. It hung there, the small weight of a promise made visible. "Will he come?" someone whispered behind her. She turned. Faces hovered in the dim. The widow with the bad wrist, the peat boy, 2 farmhands, the priest with his thin mouth, the reeve. Fear still sat in their bodies, but it had loosened its grip. Hope was a timid creature, but it had thrust its nose into the room. "At first light," she said, "with wagons." The priest cleared his throat, cautious. "Let us not blaspheme the dawn with too much expectation." But his eyes betrayed him. They were hungry. The guards ate stew by the hearth and bedded down in the corner by turns. The room settled into the deep kind of quiet that welcomes sleep but does not trust it. Ellen sat where she always sat at the end of a long day, with her hands wrapped around a simple cup of warm water, steam curling into her face like a blessing. Her father sat opposite and found his gaze tugged always to the peg. "I thought I had lost you," he said, little more than breath. "You almost did," she answered, unable to soften it. "But not to shame." He nodded once, grief and pride fighting under his skin. "What will he take in return?" "I do not know," she said. He asked for service and returned with judgment. He promised more by dawn. "Do you trust him?" She pressed her lips together. The fire popped softly. "I trust what he did when he could have done worse." Her father's eyes shone. "And if he asks for—" "He will not," she said, and in her own voice she heard not certainty but decision. "If he does, he will hear no again." They sat with that. It warmed them more than the fire did. He nodded. He looked older and lighter at the same time. When sleep came, it did not come with dreams. It came with the simple blankness of a body that had outrun a storm and needed to lie down in the dry. The first light of morning came slowly, gray drawn across the thatch. Ellen woke to the sound of hooves on wet road and the creak of heavy loads. She splashed her face with cold water and pulled her cloak close. In the yard, villagers were already gathering, pulled by the news as surely as by the sound. The wagons rolled into view one by one, wooden wheels wet to the hub, axles complaining. Sacks piled high, stamped with a mark that was not the crown's but the house's, the sign of rents paid and owed. Guards rode alongside, not loose, not tight, shoulders squared in a way she had not seen the night before. He was there. He rode not at the front, as if to be seen first, but alongside the first pair of oxen, one gloved hand on the yoke when the animals balked at the mud. He spoke low to them, and the wagon moved with a heave. He felt the eyes before he saw her. The small yard had become a little square of judgment. He drew his horse to a stop and swung down, boots sucking once in the softer earth, then finding stone. He did not look toward the threshold. He looked at the reeve first. "You will count," he said. "You will witness," he added, toward the priest. "And you," he said, turning finally toward Ellen's father, "will tell me if there is a house left unmeasured." Ellen stood a pace behind the door's frame, breath shallow. Her fingers pressed to the latch as if that small contact could hold the world where she had placed it. "Measure," the reeve said, the word sudden in his mouth. He stepped forward, set his notchstick for bushel and peck, and pressed the first sack to the scale. Grain poured, a sigh of wealth that was not luxury but survival. He leveled with a straight edge and nodded. The next followed. He, the prince they had feared, took a place at the tailgate. He heaved sacks down with the carter, his hands dirtying without remark. He did not make a show of it. He simply worked. Each sack thumped into the yard and thudded into a house along the thin street. Villagers stepped forward in turns and in order, the reeve stick tapping lightly against each measure, as if affirming a heartbeat. Ellen stepped into the yard. The morning air cut her cheeks clean. She did not lower her gaze. He felt her presence the way a man feels a fire at his back, not on the skin, but under it. He did not turn too soon. He finished setting a sack down, nodded to the carter, then looked. She stood in the doorway with the cloak closed at her throat, a familiar silhouette made newly dangerous by what it meant to him now. He inclined his head the smallest fraction. She answered with a space of silence that allowed their morning to settle into itself without breaking. He turned to his captain and took a small roll of parchment. The green wax seal had already dried hard. "Hear this," he called, not raising his voice, but shaping it so the yard carried it. "By my house's rents, under my seal." He broke it. The reeve and priest leaned forward, hands folded like parishioners. "This tavern is remitted toll on the road to market through harvest end. Grain for a charity ale will be supplied each month through the same season, under the priest's keeping and the reeve's count. No man of my retinue will press service here without writ. These terms are witnessed under the eyes of those gathered." The priest's chin dipped, first in surprise, then in acceptance. "We will account," he said. It was not flattery. It was an agreement. The reeve licked his thumb, blinking fast, and touched the seal as if testing the truth of it. "I witness," he said, voice steadier than his fingers. Ellen's father let out a breath he had been holding since the bar fell on the tavern door. He wiped at his face with the heel of his hand, unashamed of the wet there. The widow with the bad wrist covered her mouth and then dropped her hand, a sound escaping she would later call laughter and not weeping. He turned to Ellen. She met him halfway, cheeks flushed by the cold, and by something he had not earned and wanted to. He reached for his silver cup at his belt, then stopped in the motion and unhooked it, laying it on the tavern sill as if laying aside a right. He held out his empty hands. "Will you lend me measure?" he asked. She knew the language under the language. Her fingers moved to the peg without needing her eyes to guide them. She took down the wooden cup. It was clean. It was just a cup. It was more than that, because they had made it so. She placed it in his palms. "Do not spill," she said, softer than she had intended. He almost smiled. "Teach me." He lifted the cup and turned to the gathered faces. No one spoke. The morning held its breath. He did not mount the steps of the tavern, not even to be seen better. He stayed on the ground, boots muddy, cloak spattered. He raised the cup no higher than his heart. "For those I called mine," he said, "I forgot what I owed. See me remember." He drank. The wooden rim touched his mouth. The taste was simple and honest, a faint ghost of oak and smoke, the memory of last winter's brew. He swallowed, and at once felt more sober than he had in a long time. When he lowered the cup, the silence broke like ice under thaw, not into noise but into a different quiet. Judgment had shifted, a weight had been set down. He turned the cup, saw where a long-ago nick had been sanded smooth, and he wondered who had done it. He did not ask. He extended the cup back, and she did not take it immediately. The small pause widened their exchange into something everyone could see and no one could name without spoiling it. "Keep it a moment," she said. "Let the wood remember you." The reeve coughed and looked away as if privacy could be given by a glance elsewhere. The priest studied the sky. The captain feigned interest in an ox's yoke. For once, The day itself gave them cover. "Now," she said, and lifted her hand, and he placed the cup into her palm with care. They worked then. Work has a way of making fear step aside. He oversaw the order of the wagons. The reeve counted. The priest noted names in a small book in which he kept baptisms and harvests and deaths. Ellen directed where sacks were stored so mice could not find them and damp not spoil them. The guards set their shoulders to help, and the villagers did not flinch when they passed close. At one point, a strap slipped from an old woman's bundle. The prince's hand was there before the weight hit earth. He tightened the leather and nodded to her. She blessed him under her breath without theatre. These small things gathered like kindling. The yard thinned as the wagons emptied, and the sacks found corners and shelves. The smell of grain filled the air, warm and dusty. The tavern door opened and closed, the hinge complaining in the old way that made even the children smile with relief at a familiar sound. When the last bushel had been levelled, and the reeve had named it fair, the prince turned in a slow circle and saw not fear, not quite gratitude, but the beginning of a thing like trust. It humbled him in a way kneeling had not. He did one more thing. He lifted the silver cup from the sill and set it on the tavern shelf, not to be used, but to sit there as a reminder that the day had rewritten some small law. "Let this not be lifted," he said, "for a month." The priest raised an eyebrow, then nodded. It was not liturgy. It was a vow all the same. Inside, the hearth had been piled high in honor of the morning's labors. Someone, bolder than yesterday, set a whistle to his lips and coaxed a simple tune, the kind that circles a room without breaking it. The captain caught the eye of his men and nodded, and they let their shoulders loosen, swords at their sides not clattering like threats but resting like tools. He paused at the threshold, suddenly uncertain. Power had always made rooms open for him. This room held still, waiting to see which man he would be when he stepped in. Ellen stood by the bar with her hands on the wooden cup. She looked up. Their eyes met across the worn boards and the ordinary tables, and the distance between them felt like a shape the room had been asked to hold all along. "You could take the seat by the fire," she said. "As a guest." "As a guest," he echoed, tasting the word. He crossed the room and stopped a pace from the hearth. He did not sit until the innkeeper, until her father, gestured to the chair with a small, courtly incline that would have looked out of place anywhere else and fit perfectly here. He sat. The sound in the room altered. It became human again. The captain accepted a bowl of stew. The reeve stood with the priest, the two men watching as if to mark when humility became habit. Children crept closer, and then fled when he glanced their way, only to creep closer again. Ellen approached with the wooden cup and another like it. She set one before him, then the other before herself across the small stretch of table. It looked like nothing. It was everything. He put his hand on the table, palm up, the way he had in the hall, but softer. She did not place her hand in it. She set her fingers to the rim of the cup and traced the curve, then lifted it. "Will you share with us?" she asked. And the U.S. was careful, yet it rang true. "I will," he said, and the promise landed between them without weight, which is how a true thing sits. She poured from the new cask they had not dared tap yesterday. The smell was honest and strong. She raised her cup a little, not high enough to be a show, just enough that their two circles of wood framed the space between their faces for a heartbeat and brought the world to a pause. "To winter," she said. "May it be kinder." "To winter," he answered. "May we deserve its kindness." Their eyes held. It was not a courtly gaze, not a tavern glance. It was a recognition. He swallowed what rose in his throat and drank. So did she. The room moved again around them, as rooms must. When the cup came back to the table, his hand found the edge of hers without meaning to. Skin met skin for a bare moment. It burned. They both felt it. They didn't look away. The romance lay not in the touch itself, but in that refusal to pretend it had not happened. "Your men will speak of this," she said, half a smile touching the corner of her mouth. "Let them," he said. "Let them learn a new story." Her father approached with a loaf and a knife. He set it down, nodded to the prince with a respect born not of fear, but of the morning, and retreated. It felt like a blessing. They ate. They spoke more by choosing what not to say than by the words themselves. She told him quietly how winter had stripped more than larders. He told her, not boasting, how he would make amends where he had gone too far. Their sentences were short. Their silence was rich. It was conversation as a craft, not a display. Outside, clouds slid away from the sun. Light spilled across the yard and into the doorway like a shy guest. The whistle's tune rose and fell and found a second voice. Laughter started small and grew as if the room had remembered where it had put it down. He looked around and felt, for the first time in longer than he could name, like a smaller man in a larger good. It did not diminish him. It made him right-sized. He turned back to her and found she was watching him with a steadiness that did not flatter and did not condemn. It measured. He held her gaze and let himself be measured. "What am I to you now?" he asked, foolish enough to want to hear her answer. Her eyes softened at the edges. A man who listened. He could have flown on that. He kept his seat instead. He reached for the wooden cup again and paused, waiting. She pushed it nearer with the back of her fingers, her touch grazing his, the heat of the hearth settling into the space below her collarbone and spreading slow. The whistle held a final note and let it go. The room answered with contented noise. The reeve and the priest exchanged a look that was almost a smile. The captain told a short story to a boy with a missing tooth and did not make himself the hero in it. The prince lifted the cup and tilted it, then handed it to Ellen. She set it between them. They drew closer by an inch, then another, in a simple gravity that did not demand and did not ask leave. It felt inevitable and earned. No vow was spoken. None was needed. The morning had been a vow. He looked at her mouth. He did not reach for it. He reached for the space beside it, the place where warmth gathers when a person smiles and does not show it. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked, baffled and moved. "For saying no," he said, "and for saying yes today." Her throat tightened. She breathed through it, found ground under her feet, and lifted the cup one more time. He covered her hand with his for the beat it took to steady it. They drank. The wooden rim pressed both their lips in the same moment. Outside, the road took the wagon's tracks and made them part of itself. Inside, the tavern breathed in and out with the comfort of a living thing. In the space between two cups, a pride had softened into something that could carry its own weight without breaking anyone else's back. When the afternoon light turned honey and dripped down the walls, he stood. Not abruptly. He placed the chair back exactly as he had found it. He met her gaze and did not look away. "I will come again," he said. No threat in it, no command. A statement, a hope. "You know where to find the door," she said, the smallest smile given like a gift no one else could see. He bowed to her father as if greeting a lord and accepted the smallest nod in return. He stepped out into the yard without needing the room to rise. As he crossed the threshold, Ellen hung the wooden cup back on its peg. It rested there, home, and changed. She touched the rim once with 2 fingers and felt the warmth there still, as if wood could keep body heat like a secret. The door closed behind him with its old hinge song. The hearth threw gold across the room. The village kept breathing. And between one breath and the next, what had been fear turned into a belonging that would hold through winter and beyond. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.